Everyone assumes whaling started with a harpoon gun on a Norwegian ship or with New England men chasing sperm whales in wooden boats. It didn't. It's thousands of years older than that, and it belongs to almost nobody in particular because it belongs to almost everybody. In 2025, researchers studying bone harpoons from a bay in southern Brazil confirmed something that rewrote the timeline entirely. People there were hunting large whales roughly 5,000 years ago, not the Arctic, the subtropical coast of South America. Around the same era, Arctic peoples, the ancestors of today's Inuit, were already hunting bowhead whales using skin boats and cooperation across entire villages. In Korea, a cliff carved with whale hunts may date back 8,000 years. And you can understand why once you understand the math. A single bowhead whale can weigh over 200,000 pounds. One whale, properly used, could feed a community for half a year. Meat, oil for lamps, bone for tools and house frames, all from one animal. This wasn't sport. It was survival, engineered with extraordinary skill, independently, in places that had no contact with one another. So before we get to ships and empires, hold this fact in your head. Whaling is not a story about one culture doing something to nature. It's a story about human beings, everywhere there was a coast and a whale, arriving at the same idea. If ancient whaling was about survival, the next chapter is about something else entirely: profit. And the people who built the first true whaling business were the Basques on the Bay of Biscay, roughly 1,000 years ago. They targeted one species specifically, and they even named it for what it was to them: the right whale, slow, floats when it's dead. In other words, the correct whale to hunt if you don't want to lose your prize at sea. They built stone watchtowers along the coast, coordinated signal systems, and organized entire networks of villages around a single kill. Our word for the weapon itself, harpoon, comes from their language. When the whales near home grew scarce, they didn't stop. They sailed to Newfoundland and Labrador and built industrial-scale stations there in the 1500s, decades before most European colonization of the Americas even began. At its peak, 30 ships and thousands of workers a year were rendering whale oil on the edge of the New World. Centuries later, in Nantucket, then New Bedford, American whalers took the same logic and pushed it across the entire planet, chasing sperm whales for a substance called spermaceti, the purest, brightest lamp oil and candle wax known at the time. By the 1850s, New Bedford alone had more than 300 ships and 10,000 men in the trade. One voyage from that fleet ended in the story that became Moby-Dick, a real ship. The Essex, rammed and sunk by a sperm whale in 1820, its crew adrift for months, reduced to unthinkable choices just to survive. For all of that, 1,000 years of Basque skill, American global reach, there was one whale humans still couldn't catch. Too fast, too strong, and it sank when it died instead of floating. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth, and for most of history, essentially untouchable. Then, around 1870, a Norwegian named Sven Foyn solved the problem. He mounted a cannon on the bow of a steam-powered boat, loaded it with a harpoon that exploded inside the whale on impact, and pumped air into the carcass so it would float instead of sinking. It sounds simple. It ended an entire category of natural protection that had lasted since the beginning of whaling itself. Within decades, whalers built floating factories, ships longer than a football field, with a ramp built into the stern so an entire whale could be winched straight up onto the deck and processed at sea, thousands of miles from any port. One factory ship and its fleet of small hunting boats could process dozens of whales a day. In a single season in 1930 and 1931, more than 30,000 blue whales were killed in 1 year alone. Understand what that number means. 30,000 of the largest animals in Earth's history in 12 months, with a technology barely 60 years old. This wasn't hunting anymore. It was industry, at a scale nature had never had to survive before. Whale oil didn't just light lamps. It went to war. It hardened into margarine to feed ration populations, and its byproduct became glycerin, the base ingredient of nitroglycerin used in explosives. Nations tracked whale oil the way they tracked oil itself, because for a time it practically was oil. And that demand produced the darkest chapter of the entire story, one that has almost nothing to do with any nation you'd expect. Starting in the late 1940s, the Soviet Union ran fleets that hunted illegally for 30 straight years, killing protected and endangered species and systematically lying about it. Soviet biologists kept two separate sets of records, the true numbers and a falsified version sent to international regulators. When those true records were finally uncovered decades later, researchers found the USSR had killed nearly 180,000 whales. It had simply never declared to anyone. Entire regional populations wiped out so completely that a single sighting of certain whales afterward became rare enough to publish in a scientific journal. One officer aboard a Soviet factory ship was quoted saying essentially, "We should leave a desert behind us." Add up the entire 20th century across every nation that took part, American, European, Soviet, Japanese, and the tally researchers eventually reconstructed. Here is where the story turns. And it turns not because of a government, but because of a photograph. By the 1970s, several whale populations were on the edge of collapse. A small group of activists calling themselves Greenpeace sailed inflatable boats directly between Soviet harpoon ships and fleeing whales, putting their own bodies in the line of fire. A photograph of a harpoon firing over one of those small boats spread around the world and did something politics alone hadn't managed. It turned public opinion almost overnight against the entire industry. In 1982, the International Whaling Commission voted for a global moratorium on commercial whaling, taking full effect in 1986. It remains one of the most significant conservation decisions ever made, and the results are measurable. The population of humpback whales off eastern Australia has climbed from just over 100 animals in the 1960s to tens of thousands today. Some populations that were pushed to the very edge of extinction are slowly coming back. The story isn't finished, and it isn't simple. Norway and Iceland still hunt whales under formal objections to the ban. Japan left the Commission entirely in 2018 and resumed open commercial whaling in its own waters. But even there, the demand that once justified an entire global industry has largely evaporated. Whale meat consumption today sits at a small fraction of what it was at its 20th century peak. So what do you actually take from 5,000 years of this? Not a villain. Every whaling nation at some point hunted past the point of reason. Americans, Basques, British, Norwegians, Soviets, Japanese, one after another, driven by the same hunger for oil, for money, for meat. What changed wasn't one country's conscience, It was enough ordinary people worldwide deciding that a species this old, this vast, and this close to gone was worth more swimming than rendered into a barrel. That decision is barely 40 years old. Whether it holds is still being written.